You can count when you're happy. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can count when you're sad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or count when you're frightened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Count when you're mad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting is wonderful. Counting is marvelous. Counting's terrific and how.
This week, a new superpowered kid comes to town who isn't from nor has ever been to Smallville, and he's not evil. Hey, we're off to a good start. We've already broken the regular formula before the opening credits. The kid's name is Ryan, and he's telepathic. His stepfather and his new wife are criminals who use Ryan's gift to help them steal things. We get a demonstration in the teaser where Ryan uses his telepathy to get an old man's safe combination at a pawn shop. Man, it seems like these bad guys exploiting people with superpowers are always needing to get into a safe. Unfortunately for Ryan, he doesn't really have the option Clark did in the same situation, drop it out a high window onto the bad guy's car and super speed away, so he goes along with it for fear of his own safety. Then, when an opportunity presents itself, he runs away. Naturally, they're right outside of Smallville, and who else should nearly run the kid over but Martha Kent? After all, there are only 45,000 people living in Smallville, and as we all well know, every single one of them is either a Kent or a Luthor. Actually, if you look at the statistics of who almost hits whom most often in the show, you could almost make the assumption that most everyone in Smallville is either named Martha, Jonathan, or Lex. Anyway, Ryan claims to have amnesia, but of course he's lying because he doesn't want anyone to turn him back over to his psychotic stepfather. And I'm not exaggerating. This guy is so crazy, it's pretty amazing he's not from Smallville and isn't meteor infected. He randomly shoots people the whole episode for no good reason, right out in public, almost certainly making his life a lot harder for himself with the trail of dead bodies he's leaving behind. I wonder if it ever occurred to the producers of Smallville that being a thief isn't necessarily the same thing as being a murderer, or even a serial killer. This is an unsettling pattern we'll see more and more as we explore this show. Martha and Jonathan offer to take care of Ryan until Child Services can locate his parents, and they start noticing his exceptional observational skills as he knows just what Martha and Jonathan like for breakfast and intimate private details like the fact that Martha couldn't have children of her own. But he can't read Clark, which makes Ryan really curious about him. They hit it off right away, Clark realizing how great it might be to have a little brother, and Ryan looking up to Clark, who he quickly identifies as being like his comic book hero Warrior Angel, especially when he saves him later from a trash compactor. Meanwhile, Lionel gives Lex a nice big pat on his bald head and says he's been doing such an above-adequate job at the plant lately that he wants him to return to Metropolis as his main advisor. Of course, Lex sees this as nothing but another strategic move and decides that something he's been doing at Smallville is threatening to Lionel. He never expected Lex to succeed at the plant, and so he wants him where he can keep an eye on him. Now, he doesn't say this, but Lex also probably figures the way he swindled Sir Harry and Victoria out of Cadmus Labs freaked Lionel out too. But we have to guess that there's more to it than simple business posturing, since Lex has already started experimenting with the meteor rocks, as we know Lionel has also done from the Level 3 experiments revealed in Jitters. And if he's gotten wind of Lex's relationship with Hamilton, he may want to keep a tight leash on Lex for fear that he'll become too powerful in more ways than one. The intrigue is pretty involved when you put it in the context of the rest of the series thus far, which is also a little easier to spot, I must admit, in hindsight, given what we know about the meteor experiments later. Eventually, Ryan's nutso stepdad and his equally nutso wife find Ryan after pretending to be all kinds of stuff, including a private detective, child services, and Lex's limo driver. Sure, it's pretty convenient that this guy would pose as Lex's driver just as he goes over to Clark's house, especially considering there's no reason he'd know that Clark and Lex were friends, but as we've established earlier, hardly anyone else lives in this town. A chase ensues, and Clark eventually tracks Ryan and his stepfather down to a bowling alley, where he's killed his wife so he doesn't have to share any of his loot with her, and he tries to kill Ryan because, well, it's the end of a Smallville episode, and someone has to be trying to kill somebody, or there's not enough suspense. Clark, of course, saves the day via bullet-time bowling ball. Ryan promises to keep a secret. There's a genuinely tender moment where Clark and Ryan have to say goodbye, somewhat ruined by the gratuitous inclusion of Pfeiffer fighting Superman playing in the background, and then he's sent off to live with his nice, sweet aunt. But we'll see just how nice and sweet she really ends up being the next time we see Ryan. After quite the lull of not-so-great episodes we had going on there for a while, finally we get the oh-so-rare Smallville 1-2-3 punch. 1. I actually like Clark. 2. Awesome Lex subplot interestingly juxtaposed with the Clark story. And 3, and also the most unusual, hardly any Lana. In the words of Toad in Mario Kart, wahoo! I really, really like Ryan, and not just because he's a kid in dire circumstances. There's a school of thought in fiction that all you have to do is put a little kid in peril and we'll instantly care because he's a kid, and kids are automatically sympathetic. not true. Now call me an uncaring jerk, but I wanted all the kids to die in War of the Worlds. Yes, kids definitely have a handicap in the sympathy department, but you still have to make them real people with real personalities and make them proactive before I'm even kind of going to give a crap about what happens to them. Sometimes kids wind up in situations where they can't be proactive, but you have to at least give them the personality type where they're trying or they want to do something. But refreshingly, Ryan isn't whiny, he's not a boy genius, even with the telepathy, and he acts surprisingly like a thoughtful kid his age might act. I'm especially impressed with occasional subtle nuances, like when Martha picks him up from the road at the beginning of the episode and he says, "I lost my shoe." That's the kind of thing a 10 or 11-year-old would immediately concern himself with. He's instantly likable. He's smart, but he's inexperienced, so he talks too much about what he hears in people's heads, and he calls it like he sees it. A welcome change from all the lying and withholding of information the rest of our characters often do. Like a real kid might, he escapes into a simpler comic book world afraid to face reality. Lex says that the real world isn't a comic book, and things aren't so black and white. Although I think that's giving the realism of the Smallville universe a little too much credit, I really like that line. He's right, but he also believes in that idea too strongly, and it'll eventually be his downfall. I love Ryan's relationship with Clark. Their friendship is genuine, and I buy that Ryan looks up to Clark, and not just because he pulled him out of a dumpster in the exact pose as a Warrior Angel panel using the same line, "You're safe now." They have a lot in common. Both have supernatural abilities, neither really understands why he can do what he can do, and both have been exploited by people who want to use their powers for their own gain. Again, the episode is pretty subtle about this. They don't have any lengthy conversations about how they're the same and how no one else understands them like we'll get with some other characters in later episodes. That dynamic is simply there, and the episode allows us to pick up on it, or not. Jonathan and Martha's reaction to Ryan and Clark playing basketball together is touching and a little sad, because already I found myself wishing Ryan could stick around and get to be Clark's brother. And we all know, of course, that that's not going to happen. When this episode aired, I didn't like that we weren't told how Ryan got his telepathy. I thought Smallville was already starting to get lazy enough to think it didn't have to give even the flimsiest of explanations of powers anymore. And don't worry, because that day is coming. But it's actually a crucial part of Clark and Ryan's dynamic that his powers are a mystery. Luckily, he'll have a follow-up episode next season and all will be explained, which is interesting since season 2 is also the season that Clark begins to learn about the origins of his own powers. I really like the exploration we're getting this season of the manipulation of power. You'd think these people would feel like gods among insects, to quote Magneto from X2, but the reality is that power comes in many forms, and one kind of power can control another, namely intimidation, both here and with Phelan in Rogue. And what brings the story up another level is, once again, a mirror of Clark's family dynamic with Lex. This is where we first hear about Lex's baby brother Julian, who died as an infant, and of course, Lex thinks he knows how that happened, but we won't get the complete story until later. Lex says that had he lived, Lionel would have made sure they hated each other, that they would fight for his affection, and Lex thinks that Julian was the only son Lionel had a chance at actually loving, since he doesn't truly love Lex. Then toward the end, when Lex tells Lionel he's staying in Smallville, Lionel says, "Join me in Metropolis. How long have you waited to hear me say those words?" And in perhaps one of his best responses in all of these classic Lex-Lionel exchanges, Lex says, "I've waited to hear other things from you for a lot longer." And from that earlier scene about Julian, we know he means that he wants Lionel to tell him he loves him. Neither Clark nor Lex has a brother, but this episode explores in depth what having a brother would have meant for each of them and what it might have been like. And that stark contrast helps paint a clearer picture of why Clark and Lex are such different people and why they'll inevitably take different paths. And there's a profound juxtaposition in what Ryan makes of these two people. He can't read Clark's mind at all, but he trusts him completely. He can't read Lex's mind, and he very much distrusts him, to the point where he acts completely indifferent to Lex, and at the end tells Clark to be careful of Lex. There's a lot of darkness he hides from the world, he says. You get the sense that Lex's mind is so closed that beyond the thing he's thinking about the most, the offer in Metropolis, he can't glean much else besides a general sense of deception. I'd like to take this opportunity to point out the doctor who says that true amnesia is extremely rare. Oh, like I'm not going to bring that up every time we get an episode where characters, quote, aren't themselves. That's a line I bet the producers wish they could take back after what they did in the finale. Oh, you know what I'm talking about. The only thing that really isn't working for me this episode is the laziness in the writing of Ryan's step-parents. They're one-dimensional criminals, and while the exploitation of superpowers is an interesting idea to explore, it was much better handled with Phelan, who I could at least appreciate on a level of ingenuity. He was a horrible person, but he was really good at what he did. These people make no sense. The stepdad kills the guy in the teaser for really no reason. They're both careless and, in the real world, would have been caught long before they ever made it to Smallville. And again, what really drives me nuts is this notion that the only conflict we can put together for a denouement in this series is attempted murder. I suppose you could argue that when Ryan refuses to give the stepfather Lex's real password, the creep decides he's useless now and will never cooperate again, so he'd better kill him before he goes and tells the police everything he knows about him. But this guy went to a lot of trouble to find Ryan, and I'd figure he'd do everything he could to keep using this unique asset of telepathy as long as he could. But no, he's killed his wife and he's just in a killing mood, so he chases Ryan through a bowling alley because this show likes shooting horror scenes and Clark's got to move in bullet time at some point. After all, he hasn't gotten to use his superpowers nearly enough this episode. The step-parents aren't what the episode's about. They're a plot device to give Ryan a reason to run away, and for his arc to really work, he needs something to be scared of, and so they're functional in that sense. But by giving them some flimsy motivations, especially the stepfather, they come off as silly, and the conclusion is too typical, especially for an otherwise anti-formulaic episode. And questions to ask Jarrell when I get to heaven. Just one this time. Does all the popular background music in this show exist in the continuity of the show? Maybe I'm the only person in the world that's bugged by this, but I think really a little rarely, so bear with me. There was a lot of fan outcry for Pfeiffer fighting Superman to be featured in a Smallville episode. It was really popular that year, and it was about Superman, so naturally a bunch of people thought it had to show up, and it didn't matter that no matter what context you place it in, narratively, it makes zero sense. I often look for meaning in song choices when popular music is used like this. I feel like if it doesn't provide some sort of subtext or thematically parallel the story, score would be a much better choice, because otherwise it can come off as just a gimmicky advertisement for whatever singles were really big that year. The song is about how even though Superman has to look and act perfect, he's a feeling person, and being him is difficult. Well, being Clark isn't easy either, but for somewhat different reasons. After all, he's not Superman yet, and isn't in the position of being that perfect role model. The song isn't really about what the episode is about, but more than that, it's distracting, because while I'm watching that scene, all I can think about is how that song couldn't possibly exist in this universe. It's not really a problem, since we're hearing it and the characters aren't, but it's still weird. Because of that song, we've heard the word kryptonite nearly a whole season before any of the characters will ever refer to it that way. We've now already heard a red cape referenced. It's way too on the nose and making references to things that in this universe don't even exist yet. But that's a problem with other references in the show too, and I'll point them out as we get to them. And now let's go to the scoreboard. We actually have no Kryptofreak this week, regardless of Ryan's superpowers. We'll find out later exactly why Ryan got his powers, and I won't give it away here, but he's actually not a Kryptofreak. We have one car crash when Martha hits Ryan with a car. We have one character walking away angry. That's Ryan when Jonathan pushes him about why he was on the highway late at night. We have one instance of convenient unconsciousness when Lex wakes up after being thrown from his limo just after Clark super speeds up to him. We have one instance of Clark in bullet time when Clark chucks the bowling ball to hit Ryan's stepfather, and we have one bad guy who maybe died in a fight with Clark. The stepfather gets hit really hard with a bowling ball, but I'm just not sure if he's dead, so I can't count it. And I'm going to give Stray a 3.5 out of 4. Fantastic relationship between Clark and Ryan, a really gifted and genuine kid actor, and brilliant Lex-Lionel exchanges. Was there any item I missed in any category? Leave me a personal message on Geekvolution, and I'll be sure to add it to the count. I'm Captain Logan, and consider this episode counted.